All right, good afternoon. It's nice to see so many visitors here today. My name is Brant Hellwig. I'm a member of the faculty here at Washington and Lee Law School, and I also have the privilege of serving as the school's dean. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague in the Legal Academy, Alfred Brophy, back to Lexington. Professor Brophy is a member of the law school faculty at the University of Alabama, where he holds the D. Paul Jones Chaired Professorship. He has a broad array of scholarly interests, writing in traditional fields of property and trust and estates, while also exploring issues of race in colonial, antebellum, and early 20th century America. His publication record is far too extensive to detail, but I will highlight just a few of his books to provide a flavor of his research interests and expertise. In 2002, Professor Brophy published a book entitled Reconstructing the Dreamland, The Tulsa Riot of 1921, Race, Reparations, and Reconciliation with Oxford University Press. And in 2006, he authored a book entitled Reparations, Pro and Con, also with Oxford University Press. And just last year, and relevant to the topic of his lecture this afternoon, Professor Brophy published his monograph, University, Court, and Slave, Pro-Slavery Thought in Southern Colleges and Courts and the Coming of the Civil War. Also with Oxford University Press, and so he's really had a pretty good run with that fly-by-night publication shop. The topic of Professor Brophy's lecture today, Debating Slavery and Freedom at Washington College, 1831 to 1861, grew out of an invitation to deliver the Hendricks Lecture on Law and History here at Washington and Lee in the fall of 2011. Professor Brophy conducted extensive research in our university archives, examining inaugural addresses, commencement speeches, as well as the topics and voting outcomes. We might not have the text of the debates, but topics and voting outcomes of debates among student literary societies, all with the goal of reconstructing the prevailing views of slavery, abolition, and union that prevailed at Washington College in the period leading up to the Civil War. Professor Brophy's findings are remarkably interesting, and while institutional positions shifted over this period, as he will discuss, I think all of us at Washington and Lee should take heart in the degree to which our predecessors at Washington College were deeply engaged in the most pressing social issues of the time, and indeed some of the most pressing social issues in our nation's history. When President Dudley announced the formation of the Commission on Institutional History and Community a few weeks ago, one that would be accompanied by a year-long speaker series examining education and history at Washington and Lee, I immediately thought of Al's work in this area. And although Al has spoken on this topic on a few occasions here, I believe his research is of particular benefit to our law school and to our university right now. So I'm extremely grateful that Al was willing to return to Lexington on fairly short notice to lecture on this topic once again, and frankly, I hope it won't be the last time. Maybe we can just put you on a regular 2-year rotation. That would be fantastic. But would you please join me in welcoming Al Brophy back to Washington and Lee. All right, thank you very much, Al.
Well, thanks so much for your invitation. It's great to be here. Thank you, Dean Hellwig. And I've so appreciative of the great work that y'all have been doing, Provost Elizabeth Knapp, Professor Ted Delaney, Professor Murchison, among so many others, to recover an understanding of this university's history and connections to slavery. And I think we can see in the discussion of history here the world in a grain of sand. We can use Washington College, now Washington and Lee University's history over this time to understand our nation's journey towards civil war and the abolition of slavery. But I want to begin by talking today about an event that happened in 1831 across the Blue Ridge Mountains down towards Norfolk. In August of 1831, the Nat Turner Rebellion set off a discussion within the state of Virginia and nationally about the future of the institution of slavery in the United States. It was a scene of extraordinary violence in August of 1831. About 70 white people were killed in this very short-lived rebellion. And there was a lot of violence in the aftermath in which dozens, perhaps more, enslaved people were killed as sort of part of putting down the rebellion and then following the trials afterwards. One slave was executed and his head was put on a pole as a warning to others along the New Jerusalem road to try and stop further rebellion. And to this day, the place where that happened is called Blackhead Signpost Road. But there were repercussions well outside of Southampton, where the rebellion was located. Here in Lexington, a number of white citizens thought that slaves who had once been owned by John Robinson and then at that point were owned by Washington College might be getting insurrection-y. And that led to a investigation of what was going on at Hart's Bottom Plantation. And eventually the folks in Lexington were satisfied that there was no rebellion afoot here. But the repercussions continued in Richmond, Virginia, where in the spring of 1832, the General Assembly began to debate the question about whether there should be further action taken to end the institution of slavery in Virginia. The debate fell along fairly understandable geographic lines. People in the areas with heavily enslaved populations in Virginia along the Tidewater and Piedmont, their legislators largely supported the institution of slavery and not taking further action to terminate or even discuss termination of slavery, whereas people in the Shenandoah Valley and what's now West Virginia fairly routinely supported discussion of abolition or at least gradual termination of slavery. And so what you had in this debate in the General Assembly in the spring of 1832 was a sort of division. The people supporting slavery spoke about the importance of property rights, how property was a sort of existed before society. It was a sort of necessary ligaments holding society together. And they were opposed by people like James McDowell, who lived in Cole Alto in Lexington, who spoke robustly and eloquently about the natural rights of people to freedom and about the dangers of owning human beings and the danger of slave rebellion as well as economic problems with the institution of slavery. So you have in Lexington in the 1831 and 1832 politicians who are robustly speaking against slavery. At the same time, you have politicians from the Tidewater and Piedmont areas who are robustly arguing in favor of property. I want to begin to turn, and so, but 1831 is sort of a turning point, and then you get to 1835, which was the year that anti-slavery advocates in the North began to aggressively paper the country with anti-slavery literature. And so the country was shifting. And by 1837, you had James McDowell, who was, had in 1832 argued against slavery in the Virginia Assembly, appearing at Princeton University and giving a speech criticizing anti-slavery advocates and arguing in favor of slavery. Charles Bodie, who's a resident of Lexington, is working on a really terrific biography about McDowell and traces out this sort of shift from anti-slavery advocate to pro-slavery advocate. Let me shift the story, though, now to Washington College. And here I want to focus on, there are two people in particular I want to focus on. Both of them are presidents of Washington College. My first subject here is Henry Ruffner, who became president in 1837. He'd been on the faculty since 1819. And I want to put into a little bit of context Ruffner's thoughts by talking about not just slavery, but his sort of other views of ideas about constitutionalism and union. Ruffner was a Whig, which is the forerunner of the Republican Party. It's what we would now, and he was in opposition to the Democrats, the forerunner, obviously, of the Democratic Party now, of whom Andrew Jackson is sort of the probably the best known representative. And so Ruffner and other Whigs had a particular vision or critique of Democrats. And the critique was that they seemed to be unconstrained by law. They made judgments based on power rather than law. This is the critique we see of Andrew Jackson in particular. They criticized Jackson's Native American removal. They criticized sort of mob violence, the burning of the Charleston convent, which was obviously an anti-Catholic riot, and then mob violence against African Americans. And they were unhappy with what they saw as a legislature and courts taking away of private property or diminishing private property rights. So that is sort of, and what went along with that sort of general ideas about Whiggism and critique of Democrats was also the idea that we should have a union that promoted economy. That economic development was a central tenet of Whig thought. And I think you can see this also in the landscape art of this era. This is one of the most famous 19th century American works of landscape art. It's called Progress. It was done by Asher Durand at the request, in 1853, at the request of a railroad executive in Maryland. This was until fairly recently owned by the distinguished Washington and Lee alumnus Jack Warner. What you can see, and there's many ways you can think about this landscape, right? You often read pictures left to right, so on the left is earlier and on the right is later. And on the left, if you're up close, you can see the Native Americans looking on in awe and reverence at the great civilization, at the civilization created by the great white man, right? That is how this picture is sort of set up. And then you see, as you could sort of move to the right, you see sort of signs of increasing development, railroads, canals, telegraph wires, cattle being brought to the market, churches, all manner of sort of steamboats, all manner of sort of economic development. And again, these sorts of ideas of economic development as created by union are central to Whig thought. And we see this also in a painting, in a print made by the daughter of one of Washington College's presidents, Margaret Junkin Preston. And this is a scene from along the James River in Buckingham County called Mount Ida. So again, sort of images of the way in which humans improved upon nature, brought sort of civilization through human efforts and by sort of building on the landscape. That's my sort of general introduction to Whig thought and anti-slavery thought was a piece of that as well. Now let me turn to, but unfortunately, the university, the college relied on slave labor. And that's also an important piece of this story. And let me turn to the human connections to slavery on this campus. What's central to this are the 70-plus human beings who were bequeathed to the university by John Robinson's will, written in 1825. He died in 1826. But what he did was left both his plantation and humans to the university with the idea that the humans could not be sold for 50 years. That was the restriction. And maybe he thought when he was writing this in 1825 that slavery would end in the next 50 years. And if he thought that, he was correct. We have his will that had this restriction. The humans are to be kept on the plantation and not to be sold. And that then meant that the college needed to have a mechanism for renting out humans. And so this is a handbill that was printed up, I guess, in 1826, advertising the rental of humans, 20, belonging to Washington College, men, women, boys, and girls who were for rent. And then what we have is this other document, a pre-printed form, a contract for leasing humans, and it's sort of this, harnesses the technology of print to make it possible, to make it easier to rent people. And you see, if you look up here, you see that these the folks who are renting are acting on behalf of the president and trustees of Washington College. This is a contract for Millie and her child for 1 year. This, in the wake of the Nat Turner Rebellion and other events, the University, the college finds they want to sell the humans and the plantation, and then use that money for other purposes ultimately to build Robinson Hall. And so they get a opinion letter from a lawyer in the Valley that says, sure, you can go ahead and disregard this what we call restraint on alienation, restriction on sale. And so they are sold. Many end up in Mississippi, and I understand there's some very interesting work being done to locate descendants of these enslaved people of the Robinson. And what we end up with then is a monument to John Robinson and Robinson Hall. Some people are not sold. Some of them are elderly and infirm, and so are not sold. And at one point in 1842, the university trustees pay somebody to take care of a small number of enslaved people. That's the story that I have about the human connections to slavery. But I want to spend time and focus on the ideas about slavery and anti-slavery that took place on this campus and in this town. And here we have a story of Henry Ruffner, the president who came in 1837, and he's here till 1848. And Ruffner is a person who was anti-slavery. He began speaking in 1843. He gave an extended lecture to the Rockbridge Colonization Society about the attempt to take free people and recently freed people and remove them to Africa. There's Nellie Young did a terrific book on the sort of colonization ideas in Rockbridge County. There's a lot to be said about the colonization movement and ways in which it was deeply concerned with race and exclusion. And then there's also a narrative about them that this is one of the few forms of anti-slavery behavior or advocacy that could be acceptable in the South. So there's a lot to be said, and they're conflicting stories about how to think about colonization. But Ruffner also, in 1847, put together a pamphlet that was based on debates that took place in the Franklin Literary Society here in Lexington, running from January through, I guess, about April of 1847, in which Ruffner and other people like John Lecter, who ended up shockingly as governor of Virginia later in life, took an anti-slavery position against people like Francis Smith, who was commandant of VMI, and Judge John Brokenbrough, a federal judge based here in Lexington. And so you had this long-running weekly debate about slavery and anti-slavery, in which Ruffner took the position that he argued less on issues of morality of slavery and more on issues of economics, so sort of that the economic harm and inefficiency of the institution of slavery made it harder to have economic development. So, and again, there's sort of really interesting questions about why was the debate largely on economic rather than moral grounds, and at least one argument one would make is because that was the grounds on which these arguments could be heard. Ruffner argued later in life that the debates had been around the question of, is slavery injurious to the United States? So an economic rather than a moral argument. And in this he was joined by other people like George Dabney, a professor of classics here, who went on and emancipated about 6 of his humans as well. In 1848, Ruffner leaves Washington College. There are a number of reasons why this takes place, but it appears that at least part of it is in conflict with the trustees who were unhappy with his anti-slavery position. And the person who replaces him is George Junkin, who was removed from his position at Miami University of Ohio for having argued a pro-slavery position. So what you have is sort of this change of anti-slavery faculty leaving the South and pro-slavery faculty leaving the North, sort of reshuffling. During Junkin's time here, we had a number of increasingly pro-slavery arguments and pro-slavery faculty. So Junkin was known for his 1843 address in Cincinnati that supported slavery, that had sort of in some ways tried to minimize the harms of slavery by pointing out there are many institutions in American culture that lead to some evils. Marriage is one of them, but he says we don't dispose of marriage and we shouldn't dispose of slavery. He continues speaking once he's here at Washington College about the importance of communion with slave owners and the threats that anti-slavery advocacy posed to union. In this regard, he is very similar to a number of sort of more conservative people in the North. Daniel Webster sort of gives an 1850 address in Congress supporting the Compromise of 1850. It's very similar. Junkin's sort of arguments about moderation and support and refusing to take a stand against slavery, very, very similar to what you see with Daniel Webster. And then we have some other folks here. D.H. Hill, who ends up life as a Confederate officer, Confederate general, was a mathematics professor here at Washington College, and shortly after leaving here, he published a mathematics textbook. He went to Davidson next and published a mathematics textbook. I'll leave this to the mathematicians and the people who do natural science to try and answer these sorts of questions. But we have all manner of that even the math textbook was harnessed to make the Yankees look bad and in the sort of the questions that they asked students to complete. So there are other ways of trying to gauge ideas, the intellectual culture of Lexington and Washington College. One thing that's incredibly useful are these student literary debates. So about every 2 weeks on campus, the Graham and the Washington Literary Societies had debates, and they were wide-ranging, but oftentimes they related to issues of empire and slavery. And I think you can use these as a way of gauging what was going on in how students were thinking about problems. So I want to sort of have a little timeline, right? You recall Henry Ruffner leaves in 1848. So I want to look a little bit before he leaves and then a little bit after he leaves to sort of try and get some sense of the changes in ideas and the culture on campus. So in 1845, the students debate, is slavery a moral evil? And they say, yes, it is. That's the conclusion of the debate. We don't know the content, but we know the question and then the result. In 1846, they say, should slavery be abolished? And say, no, it may be a moral evil, but it shouldn't be abolished. And that's a not uncommon sort of divide that you would have. 1851, after Junkin is president, then they say, is slavery beneficial to the interests of the world? And they say yes. So we've moved from it's immoral to it shouldn't be abolished to it's beneficial. In 1852, they ask, is slavery injurious to the interests of the South? And they say no. And you'll recall that was the question that Ruffner said his Franklin Literary Society debate was about. Ruffner was arguing in 1847 that slavery was injurious to the interests of the South, but by 1852 the students here are saying it is not. And then the next year they ask, is slavery a moral evil? And so it's the same question they had about 6 years before, and they say, no, it's not. So you can trace this sort of changing ideas. And then the next year after that, 1854, has the institution of slavery produced more good than evil? And yes, it has. These are the evolving conclusions of these students. And then in 1855, is slavery in accordance with the dictates of humanity? Yes, it is. So what we're seeing is this sort of increasingly pro-slavery approach among the students, and my argument is that maps pretty closely the increasing pro-slavery ideas that we see in Southern culture and Northern culture to some extent as well. Now, let me put this in contrast. I want to look at Washington College in contrast with VMI, a neighboring institution, and I think that will help us give a sense of sort of how ideas developed here and put into context sort of the pro-slavery and anti-slavery ideas of Washington College. So at VMI, we have, in 1850, Judge Brokenbrough giving a Lexington resident, giving an address at VMI. And here, he contemplates disunion, where Junkin is pro-union at Washington College. At about that same time, you've got somebody speaking at VMI contemplating disunion and demanding that the union be on the terms of the Constitution as Southerners interpreted the Constitution. So again, sort of, I think it's important to look at Washington College in contrast with other institutions. Washington College, pro-union, VMI, already a decade before, you recall the Civil War begins in 1861, a decade before the Civil War begins, VMI has speakers who are contemplating disunion. Now, so that's Judge Brokenbrough's July 4th address. I want to fast forward to 1856, and I want to look at three addresses to give a sort of sense of the range of ideas. So you've got President Junkin gives an address up at Rutgers in the North. So he's gone up to the North to deliver an address for tolerance, where he asks for tolerance for slave owners, and he talks about the ways in which slavery has generated many benefits. He talks about the ways that slavery had civilized more people over 2.5 centuries than any other institution known to humankind. It was a very pro-slavery speech, and it was asking for tolerance for slave owners and for a call for union. Henry Ruffner, who was now retired from Lexington and was speaking in his hometown of Kanawha Salinas, gave a speech a few days later in which he also pled for union, talked about the economic benefits of union, but also and was asked for moderation and tolerance on all sides. He was critical of pro-slavery people and he was critical of anti-slavery people. So again, you get sort of these different ideas between Junkin, Ruffner, and then Governor Wise, Virginia's Governor Wise, also gave an address July 4th, 1856, at the dedication of this statue of George Washington, which is still on the VMI campus. And there, Wise again sort of spoke about the need for union. He harnessed Washington's image as sort of a unionist, but also as a states' writer. And he argued that we needed to contain sectional divisions and then use that as an opening for an attack on the anti-slavery zealots he saw in Massachusetts. So we get a whole sort of range of ideas here. And in these range of ideas, I think we can begin to get a sense of how people at Washington College fought against slavery and then shifted to a more pro-slavery approach. but always, or in many instances, a pro-union approach. I now want to talk a little bit about the road to secession here, and here I want to focus not on what's going on in Washington College's campus, because you don't have people arguing, you don't have speakers coming in to argue for secession, but at VMI you do have speakers. In 1857 you have a visiting lawyer, James Massey, who speaks about the importance of calculates the value of union, and then says that slavery is giving incalculable benefits to the South, and even in the North, they're beginning to feel the conservative elements of slavery. And Massey goes on to talk not just about the importance of slavery, but the importance of secession if the institution of slavery is not protected. This is followed the next year by a speaker, Willoughby Newton, who's in the U.S. House of Representatives from Virginia. And he says, I'm not even going to talk about the importance of slavery. The day for argument about slavery is past. And such a flood of light has been shed upon it during the last few years in all its aspects, moral, social, religious, political, economy, that nothing more remains to be said. And yet, he goes on to talk about how great the institution of slavery is. The landing in Virginia from a Dutch ship in the month of August 1820 of 20 African slaves has been in its results one of the most remarkable events in the history of mankind. Inconsiderable in itself, revolting as it may be to the natural feeling, no calm observer of the progress of human affairs can fail to perceive in it the beginning of a mighty agency for the advancement of wealth, happiness, civilization, and refinement of the world. Those are the arguments that you hear on VMI's campus, and then Newton goes on to say that the time is fast approaching when there will be no alternative but separation from the North or tame submission to its uncontrolled despotism. So, years before Lincoln's election, people at VMI, or speakers at VMI, are already talking about the need for secession, calculating the value of union, finding it wanting, and arguing for secession. And that's one of the reasons, the ways in which VMI is justified, is it is an institution that is preparing people to defend the South through force if necessary. That then brings us to November 1860, and the election of President Lincoln, and then the spring of 1861. And a student puts a secession banner up on the top of Washington Hall. George Junkin pulls it down, has a confrontation with the student, and then Junkin leaves. He resigns the presidency and goes back to Pennsylvania, which is where he was from. And Junkin writes right at the end of the war of this sort of sadness in how everything, the violence, everything had unfolded, disunion. And he talks about how he was sad to read in the reports of the Battle of Bull Run how the student who he'd fought with a few months before had died at that battle. And then he writes that in the wake of the battle at Gettysburg in July of 1863, he goes over to visit with Confederate prisoners of war, and he has a reunion with some of his students. It's poignant and such improbable stories of the way in which ideas about slavery, union, freedom clashed and then so unfolded in ways people could never have dreamed. So that's my story of these wide-ranging ideas on this campus, in this town, in this state, in this nation, how we as Americans struggled, how to think and act about slavery, freedom, and union, and the ways in which we can, I think, use the events here as a microcosm for understanding these sorts of, momentous struggles as Americans. I'd love to hear what y'all are thinking about this, and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks. I'd love to. Yeah, absolutely. I hope folks have questions. Are probably going to be more fun than listening to me talk. Yeah. Yes.
Al, you talked about how the views on slavery changed among the student body and that reflected a larger trend in the South. What do you think accounts for that? Is it a reaction to the abolitionists?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. It's a great question. So the question is, they're changing views among students here and among students throughout the South, and in fact throughout not just students but throughout the South. So there's a couple of traditional stories, and I think it's a really interesting question to think about the multiple regression equations that explains the sort of changing ideas. So partly, I think it's driven by changing economics. The institution of slavery is increasingly of great economic importance. In the wake of the Nat Turner Rebellion in 1831, there's a professor, Thomas Dew, at William and Mary, who writes a very important pro-slavery treatise, and was used as a textbook at VMI right up until close to the Civil War anyway, where he talks about even if we wanted to end the institution of slavery, it could not be done in Virginia because of the economic disaster that would follow. And this is an argument that pro-slavery people make when they look at the emancipation in the West Indies that Great Britain does in the 1830s. They say this is such an economic and demographic disaster for the white owners, that it can't be done in the United States. So I think it's important to remember the just pure economics of this. I do think there is a changing the anti-slavery attitudes, which became increasingly and aggressively robust. Probably caused a reaction. That's a common argument, right? And I think as you had this sort of dialogue between anti-slavery and pro-slavery people, the pro-slavery arguments became more robust, and I think that they were legitimized by politicians. They were legitimized by the Supreme Court. As the Supreme Court became more aggressively pro-slavery, that I think opened up space that made it easier for the pro-slavery arguments to gain power. I think there's a number of things that are going on. I suspect at Washington College, at least one of the things that was going on is that when Henry Ruffner was here, speaking aggressively and publicly and publishing anti-slavery arguments, that opened up space for more anti-slavery advocacy. And then once he's gone and Junkin comes in, that closes some of the space for the anti-slavery advocacy. This is fascinating to me, and I think we see sort of examples of this in contemporary politics, how we as a people take our cues about politics and culture from our leaders. And so as leaders change, that alters the space that us humble little people are going to occupy. Yeah.
Speaking regarding the two sides and the conflicts, was there ever any discussion regarding a process from the abolitionists to how they can accommodate the Southern feel that we have to have slavery versus the North over a process of 10 or 15 years?
Yeah, so it's a super interesting question, right? So is there, was there some way in which the anti-slavery folks said, hey, maybe let's have a form of advocacy that is as effective as possible, right? That's essentially, and so some of the anti-slavery people were just aggressively and robustly anti-slavery. And no compromise with slave owners, and in some ways I think that was a fairly there's always sorts of action and then reaction. It ends up being a fairly effective technique. There's a really interesting discussion we can have about what leads to why does civil war happen in 1861, given the incredible power and wealth of the South and the interests of people North and South in the institution of slavery, the economic interests in slavery. In part, I think that was driven by the robustness of the anti-slavery movement, the uncompromising sense in the anti-slavery movement. And because you had that uncompromising attitude, then you had the reaction in the South, which was secession, which obviously ended slavery much earlier than it would have happened had there not been Civil War, right? Asking somebody in November of 1860, when will slavery end? Nobody would have put a bet on within 5 years. So you have politicians who are incredibly counterproductive. But to return to your question, there were people, and I think Ruffner is a great example of this, who were anti-slavery, probably zealously anti-slavery, but were trying to operate within a space that would be at least a moderate space that looked like it would be effective. I think that's why Ruffner has all of these economic arguments and leaves aside these moral arguments. And he's going, I'm going to try and argue with you on the terms that make sense to you, which is that slavery is not a great idea economically. I'm not actually sure. There's a big discussion now about the efficiency of slavery. I'm actually not sure that Ruffner was correct on that, but he was trying to reach people at a space that I think they could hear. I think that's what's going on. Seth, did you?
I did have a question on the graphic that showed Junkin's speech. I guess, I don't know, in the title of that, in his defense in Cincinnati, you notice that there's a Bible reference.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could comment on the significance, especially in the South, of the church and its role in perpetuating the shift.
Yeah, no, thanks. Religious thought is an area that I work in substantially less. There are undoubtedly many people in this room who know infinitely more, including you, about this topic than I do. Junkin, like Ruffner, was a Presbyterian minister, and so it's unsurprising that he's speaking in terms and to religious societies. One of the things that interests me about their important parallels between religious and legal thought, you'll have people like Daniel Webster speaking about the importance of union from a legal perspective, and then you have people like Junkin speaking about the importance of union from a religious perspective. And there's you have both religious and legal thought being mobilized on both sides, both pro-slavery and anti-slavery. And I think one of the stories that's important is that religious thinkers are making this same trip towards increasing pro-slavery ideas that I often trace more along the lines of legal thinkers. There's a letter that some Presbyterian minister sends to Henry Ruffner around 1837. So about the time that James McDowell is at Princeton, abandoning his earlier anti-slavery ideas and saying, slavery is important and we need to continue the institution of slavery, and that's the foundation of union. So McDowell, legal thinker, makes that shift. A Presbyterian minister writes to Henry Ruffner and says, around the time of the Nat Turner Rebellion, I was actually against slavery, but the anti-slavery folks have been so aggressive and toxic, destructive, something like that, he doesn't use the word toxic, have been so destructive that I have begun to shift, like other people, towards support of slavery. I mean, it is a really interesting move that Southerners, politicians, religious leaders, lawyers, professors seem to be making to increasing support of slavery, and is you have this sort of culture moving in towards slavery across professions. Yeah, go. Yeah, continue.
What's so interesting is the way people receive their information during that era. So much different than now. So how influential those ministers were and the messages in local churches in small towns.
I mean, so it's super interesting, right? There's substantially less information. So you have party newspapers being super important. You've got, oratory, these kinds of addresses. You obviously have, it's unsurprising that religious and legal thought are so similar because you've got religious leaders who are speaking to lawyers and vice versa. And these things move in consonance, I think, in a way that we don't see now. It's so splintered, as you say, the way in which people get information now is substantially more splintered. Good. Love to talk. Yeah, go.
So I find it deeply unsettling how the moral conversation kind of gets short shrift, and I doubt you're going to be able to say anything to make me feel any better, but I would like you to talk more about that and maybe where the moral conversation was happening, if it was, and the interaction.
So it's super interesting. I think people like Ruffner, who, after he leaves Washington College, goes and writes several pamphlets that are published anonymously that are zealously anti-slavery. And so I think, Ruffner is somebody who, we think as lawyers, role, morality issues, was constrained in what he could do. And he was when he was president, he was trying to reach people, and he was arguing on the grounds, I think only grounds that would be calculated to be successful. So he was constrained, even though I think in private he was zealously anti-slavery, he was constrained in the ways in which he could do that in public. And so you've got Ruffner making economic arguments, you've got the American Colonization Society, the Rockbridge Colonization Society also, trying to do things to gradually end slavery. And that invites all sorts of questions about, like, could they have done more? Could they have had a different mode of advocacy that might have been better calculated to end slavery sooner? I think a lot of this needs to be at least viewed through the lens of the difficulty of being a more robust anti-slavery advocate. There are certainly, one of the things that I think is important, and this was why I was interested in bringing the VMI lectures into dialogue, because you get to see, put Washington College in context with VMI. You could also put it in context with some of the, lectures at Oberlin College where there's zealously anti-slavery. You can see the whole range, and I think it's important to see the whole range. Yeah. How's that sound? I'd love to talk. I'd love to talk infinitely more about these kinds of things. Go.
So you said that when Governor Henry Wise gave his talk about Washington, he said that Washington was, of course, a nationalist. He also made reference to Washington as a states' rightist. I'm not so sure. I'm strong on Washington as a nationalist, not so much as a state rightist. But also I want to know how much before the Civil War was states' rights a big issue as opposed to after.
As opposed to, as opposed to like a post hoc rationalization after the war. So many cool things. So I've got a whole lecture that I'd love to download on the Washington equine statue on Capitol Square in Richmond, Virginia. This sort of, y'all know this, it's the sort of, it was put up around 1858, and it becomes the symbol of the Confederacy. Literally, the Confederate symbol is Washington on its horse from the Capitol in Richmond. When that's put up in 1858, there's a series of addresses that are given. One is Washington is Unionist, one is Washington is states' writer, and one is Washington is slave owner. And so you've got people each picking, obviously I think you and I, probably most people in this room, think of Washington mostly as, Unionist. But there were other people who were trying to harness the image of Washington and remake that image to their own particular purpose. So, and Wise was among the more moderates, and so he was saying, Washington supported Union, and so what we need to do is pull together and support Union. But he was also, there are also elements in Wise's address, this sort of Washington as, supporting the rights of Virginians, and so, we don't want to have Virginians being dictated to by the federal government. I think that's not, you think of things like the Whiskey Rebellion, that is, where is Washington as states' writer? But I think the neat thing about this is that's how people are taking Washington and remaking him to their image. So many things to talk about here. This Washington statue is constructed by enslaved labor. So in the Virginia State Library, you've got the receipts for, Harry, or Alfred, who was purchased by the Washington Monument Association to help construct the site. There's so many things. Oh, wait, we have to stop. I understand.
Oh no, I've got one more actually before we stop. That's all right.
Okay. Ted Delaney, I think, was the line. We'll let him be the last, and then we will all go off for fall break. Yes, thank you.
Problem with making the colonization society moderates. The colonization society would not have existed in the South if they had been associated in any way with abolitionism. And the National Colonization Society, the members read like a who's who of slaveholders. And so what I say the Colonization Society doing principally is getting rid of free blacks. Free blacks who are a paradox, free blacks who they view as dangerous. And so I'm not convinced that the Rockridge Colonization Society was as moderate as they might.
Yeah. I mean, so excellent point, right? And in one way, thank you for that. And one way to think about this is, in the wake of the Nat Turner Rebellion, the two statutory changes after they decide, hey, Virginia legislature decides, hey, we're not going to do anything to end slavery. The two things they do is set aside money for colonization of free people, and then make fashion the shackles tighter on enslaved people, so you can't have enslaved people can't have religious meetings unless they're being supervised by a white person. So I think those are really super important critiques of colonization. The one sort of counterpoint I'd point out is that James Birney, who runs for president on the Liberty Party in 1840, started off life with the Colonization Society, right? So I mean, I think there's some people who are acting under the guise of colonization who would like to be more radical, even if many, many, many people in the Colonization Society were, basically dreamed of a republic in which there were no people of African descent. How's that sound? Thank you so much. I hope to continue the conversation.